TV and American history programming. You can check it all out on our website at cspan.org and our new local content vehicle at cspan.org. Thanks for being with us on this Friday. We're back tomorrow morning with the Washington Journal. Enjoy the rest of your day and have a great weekend.
The House will be in order. Prayer will be offered by our chaplain, Father Conroy.
Let us pray. Eternal God, we give you thanks for giving us another day. We pause in your presence and ask guidance for the men and women of the people's house. Enable them, O God, to act on what they believe to be right and true and just, and to do so in ways that show respect for those with whom they disagree. In this, may they grow to be models and good examples in a time when so many in our world are unable to engage gracefully with those they are at odds with. May the members realize that your congregation is wider and broader than ever we could measure or determine. Help them and help us, O Lord, to put away any judgments that belong to you and do what we can to live together in peace. As we approach this next recess, bless our great nation and keep it faithful to its ideals, its hopes, and its promise of freedom in our world. Bless us this day and every day, and may all that is done within the people's house be for your greater honor and glory. Amen.
The Chair has examined the journal of the last day's proceedings and announces to the House his approval thereof, and pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 1, the journal stands approved. The Pledge of Allegiance today will be led by the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Nunley.
Please join me as we pledge our flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The Chair will entertain up to 5 one-minute requests on each side. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise? Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks. Mr. Speaker, later this morning we will be debating and voting on 2 resolutions dealing with Libya. The first one, H.J. Res. 68, has been said to be one that literally endorses exactly what the President has been doing, and I agree with that. Even though it excludes ground troops, it doesn't talk about special forces, CIA, contractors, and unlimited bombing, which is really what we have to restrict. But the second one, H.R. 2278, has been said to be more strongly worded in restraint on the President, and this is where I disagree. I believe the wording is different, and it says no funds for ground troops, but then it has exceptions. And the exceptions are for all the things that we're already doing. So I believe if we vote and pass the second one, it will be the first time this Congress has given authority to the President for what he is doing right now. So I urge my colleagues to look at both of these carefully. I have concluded that not only should the first one be voted down, but it's very important that the second one be voted down as well.
Gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio rise?
Mr. Speaker, good morning. I request permission to address the House for 1 minute. Advise and extend.
Gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Kucinich, is recognized for 1 minute.
We've been in Afghanistan for 10 years at a cost of over $500 billion. In Iraq for 8 years at a long-term cost of at least $3 trillion. Those who told us the war in Libya would last days now want to extend it for another year at a total cost of billions. It is surreal that we could even be considering authorizing this war at a time when the government is collapsing in debt. Those who told us the war in Libya was to save civilians' lives quickly switched to regime change, with innocent civilians dying from NATO's bombs. Prior to NATO assuming responsibility, we launched hundreds of cruise missiles and dropped tons of bombs on Libya. Since NATO took over, the U.S. has struck from the air at least 90 times, including drone attacks. But these are not hostilities claims the White House. So what business is it of Congress? We must put an end not only to the war in Libya, but we must put an end to the thinking that the Constitution is a doormat and that our constituents must simply bear the consequences of the misguided policies of this administration without this Congress having any say whatsoever. Defeat the authorization for the war, vote for the Rooney Bill, which limits the war, and when we return, let's vote for a total cutoff of funds for this wrong-headed adventure.
The gentleman's time has expired. What purpose does the gentleman from Mississippi rise? Without objection, the gentleman from Mississippi is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, President Obama executed a short-sighted energy plan and released 30 million barrels of oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, all while the United States combined recoverable oil, natural gas, and coal resources is 1.3 trillion barrels of oil equivalent, the largest in the world. We have 40,000 times more American natural resources under our ground than the amount President Obama took out of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Drawing down reserves intended for national emergencies is far from the energy plan we need, especially when we're sitting on abundant resources. President Obama must quit blocking American energy production. Mr. President, if you want to make us energy secure, if you want to see a thriving economy creating jobs, if you want to free Americans from the burden of high gas prices, unleash the power and ingenuity of American energy exploration, and do it now. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. What purpose does the gentleman from Florida rise? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tomorrow marks the 5th anniversary of the abduction of Israeli soldier Staff Sergeant Gilad Shalit from inside Israel's borders by the terrorist organization Hamas. For 5 years, Hamas has violated international human rights conventions by denying Shalit contact with his family and visits by the International Red Cross. Now Hamas wants to be partners with the Palestinian Authority. If the Palestinian Authority is determined to pursue unity with Hamas, then President Abbas must demand that his new partner free Sergeant Shalit. Israel can never be expected to negotiate with an organization that remains bent on its destruction, but if Hamas ever expects to have a seat at the table, it must show good faith now and immediately release Gilad Shalit. We stand here today with our great ally Israel. We stand here with allies from Europe and throughout the world. We stand with all who believe in and fight for basic human rights. Anyone who can hear my voice knows that Gilad Shalit must be released. I yield back.
What purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
Permission to address the House for 1 minute.
You're recognized.
Mr. Speaker, America's third war continues. The President's little war in Libya is unconstitutional, and it also violates the War Powers Resolution. Even the administration says Libya is not a national security risk to America. So why are we at war in Libya? Because the French want us there? Mr. Speaker, don't you think we've done enough for the French in World War I, World War II, and even in Indochina, what we now call Vietnam? The United States should not be involved in Libya's civil war. The cost has been over $700 million to the American taxpayer. Mr. Speaker, don't you think that money, that millions of dollars, could be better spent building America instead of blowing up Libya? And who are these rebels in Libya that we are supporting? Of course, Omar Gaddafi is a tyrant, but we may end up replacing an oppressive regime with an extremist radical regime. Now, isn't that lovely? Congress should cut off all American funds to the President's little war in Libya, and that's just the way it is.
What purpose does the gentleman from California rise?
To address the House for 1 minute.
You're recognized.
It appears this morning and today the House of Representatives and Congress will be carrying out its constitutional responsibilities dealing with the war in Libya. Resolutions will be on the floor. Appropriately, we will be voting today on whether we want to end, limit, or extend. For me, I think we have to carry out the UN resolution that calls for the right to protect, or the obligation and duty to protect. That's why the Libyan situation started. That needs to be completed. I would suggest that the Hastings resolution that gives a year is good, in that it provides the necessary restrictions on the White House and on the military in the Libya operation, and basically puts the United States in a support position. I would prefer that there be an amendment to that. Perhaps it will be in a recommendation to recommit, that it be limited to 6 months. Yield back my time.
The gentleman from California yields back his time. What purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas rise? Without objection, the gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. There are many issues that we must address in this august body, but it is tragic to note that we've been here for 24 weeks since the GOP took responsibility and control of this House, and we've done nothing to create jobs. In fact, the majority leaders indicate the Republicans have no plans to do anything on jobs through this summer. Why does this pose a crisis? Because in the midst of all of this, a number of mergers are coming into fruition. In particular, the United Continental merger. We've already had an announcement that Houston will lose 1,500 jobs, and no response from United or Continental. In addition, United had a recent collapse of its database or its system and caused massive shutdowns and clogging of the system, where passengers were stuck in airports because they couldn't get their planes off the ground. When we have mergers with no restraint and no oversight, we have a problem. So jobs are necessary to be created, and there needs to be oversight over mergers like Continental and United, so that communities like Houston and elsewhere won't be losing jobs with no response. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Minnesota rise? Without objection, the gentleman from Minnesota is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to honor a piece of American history and to pay tribute to the Americans that created it. 2011 marks the 50th anniversary of the International Harvester Scout, the first scout built out of American ingenuity and steel, rolled off the assembly line 50 years ago in Fort Wayne, Indiana. The creation of Ted Ornis, literally drawn on a napkin at his kitchen table. In the near future, my good friend from Indiana, Joe Donnelly, and I will come to this floor at the end of the day to tell the history of this great company and the iconic IH Scout. We'll also tell the stories of those who restore, drive, and keep the legacy alive. These are the stories of America, stories of hardworking people who respect our history and believe it is worth preserving. The Scout reflects the exceptional American personality, ingenuity, thriftiness, self-reliance, and a can-do spirit. The Scout was built in the heartland of Indiana on these principles. I want to thank Jeff Bade and John Glancy for helping put this effort together. Honoring our history reminds us of what we were capable of together in this great nation. I yield back.
The gentleman from Minnesota yields back his time. What purpose does the gentleman from Florida rise?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the Committees on Transportation and Infrastructure and Ways and Means be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 2279 and ask for its immediate consideration in the House.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 2279. A bill to amend the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 to extend the funding and expenditure authority of the Airport and Airway Trust Fund, to amend Title 49 United States Code, to extend the Airport Improvement Program, and for other purposes.
Is there objection to consideration of the bill? Without objection, the bill is engrossed, read a third time, and passed, and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
Mr. Speaker.
What purpose does the gentleman from Wisconsin rise?
I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the bill just passed, H.R. 2279.
Without objection, so ordered.
they're going to do that.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that when the House adjourns today, it adjourn to meet at 10 a.m. on Tuesday, June 28, 2011, and that when the House adjourns on that day, it adjourn to meet at 10 a.m. on Friday, July 1, 2011.
Without objection. Purpose does the gentleman from Georgia rise?
Mr. Speaker, by direction of the Committee on Rules, I call up House Resolution 328 and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the resolution.
House Calendar Number 48, House Resolution 328, resolved that upon adoption of this resolution, it shall be in order to consider in the House the joint resolution, House Joint Resolution 68, authorizing the limited use of the United States Armed Forces in support of the NATO mission in Libya, if called up by the Chair of the Committee on Foreign Affairs or her designee. All points of order against consideration of the joint resolution are waived. The joint resolution shall be considered as read. All points of order against provisions in the joint resolution are waived. The previous question shall be considered as ordered on the joint resolution to final passage without intervening motion except 1 hour of debate with 40 minutes equally divided and controlled by the Chair and Ranking Minority Member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs, and 20 minutes equally divided and controlled by the Chair and Ranking Minority Member of the Committee on Armed Services, and 2, one motion to recommit. Section 2, upon adoption of this resolution, it shall be in order to consider in the House the bill, H.R. 2278, to limit the use of funds appropriated to the Department of Defense for United States Armed Forces in support of North Atlantic Treaty Organization Operation Unified Protector with respect to Libya, unless otherwise specifically authorized by law, if called up by the Chair of the Committee on Armed Services or his designee. All points of order against consideration of the bill are waived. The bill shall be considered as read. All points of order against provisions in the bill are waived. The previous question shall be considered as ordered on the bill to final passage without intervening motion except 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by Chair and Ranking Minority Member of the Committee on Armed Services, and 2, one motion to recommit.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 1 hour.
Mr. Speaker, for the purpose of debate only, I yield the customary 30 minutes to the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Slaughter, pending which I yield myself such time as I may consume. During consideration of this resolution, all time is yielded for the purpose of debate only.
And the gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, House Resolution 328 provides a closed rule for consideration of H.R. 2278 and H.J. Res. 68. The rule provides a total of 3 hours of debate in this chamber on this vitally important issue of U.S. military operations in Libya. The rule also provides the minority with 2 separate motions to recommit, with or without instructions. Mr. Speaker, it was in this week in 1788, June 21st of 1788, that the United States ratified its Constitution, that Constitution that still serves us so well today. And in that Constitution, our framers made clear that the power of the purse belongs here and here alone, here in the people's house, here on Capitol Hill. And that Constitution made clear that the power to declare war lies here and here alone. On June 3rd of this year, by a vote of 268 to 145, the House of Representatives passed a resolution asking the President to make clear what his intentions are in Libya, asking the President to come and consult with Congress, to get Congress's permission to seek our authority to prosecute those hostilities in Libya. We've received some information from the White House since then. We've gotten a letter from the White House since then. We even have classified documents since then. But what we have not had since then, Mr. Speaker, is an opportunity for the American people to make their voice heard on this important issue. Because after all, this isn't an issue for Congress. Because as a congressman, it's not about my voice. It's about the voice of the 911,000 people back home that I represent, that I bring here to Congress.
and those people's voice have yet to be heard on this Libya issue. Operation Odyssey Dawn, in full operation now since the month of March, and the people's voice has still not been heard. But today, Mr. Speaker, the Rules Committee, as one of the longest-standing committees in this U.S. House of Representatives, first constituted in 1789, the Rules Committee is making that opportunity available with these two resolutions. Mr. Speaker, my hope is that the people's voice will be heard today, that in these hour upon hour of debate that we have today, these two very different choices for where this country goes, that the American people will, for the first time, have their voice heard on the question of Libya. As you know, Mr. Speaker, when we come back in July, we're going to take up the FY 2012 defense bill. In fact, we'll take it up tonight and start considering amendments when we return. We'll again have an opportunity to have our voice heard because, Mr. Speaker, there is an entire gradation of options that we have here. Are we going to declare war on Libya? Are we going to allow the President to continue what he's doing in Libya? Are we going to shut down the funding for troops on the ground in Libya? Are we going to shut down funding for Libya altogether? These are the questions that the Rules Committee has made available today and next week, so 2 weeks from now, that this House will be able to have its voice heard. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves. For what purpose? Gentleman from New York rise.
To bring up the bill, I ask unanimous consent that I may consume such time as I need. And
gentlewoman is recognized.
Appreciate it. First, I want to thank my colleague very much for yielding the time. Mr. Speaker, we're considering matters of war and peace today. On Sunday, our nation will have been engaged in military action in Libya for 100 days. The actions taken by the President have a grave impact on the constitutional role of Congress and the role of the United States abroad. Taken together, these are among the most important issues that we, as members of Congress, will ever consider. These are the very debates that scholars and historians will study and analyze for decades to come. Given these fundamental issues, the American people deserve the full and thorough consideration that should be afforded to all legislation introduced into the body, with committee hearings and debate, followed by an open and regular process and a thoughtful debate by the whole House. In 1990, when I was first here, the body considered a resolution regarding matters of war and peace. At the request of President George H.W. Bush, both chambers of the United States Congress engaged in a fierce debate about whether to authorize the use of military force in the Persian Gulf. I have vivid memories of those debates long ago into the night, with the issues being debated in committees, marked up by both parties, brought to the House floor for final debate before the American public. And on that particular measure concerning the Persian Gulf, we had 25 hours of debate and 263 members spoke. It was one of the most thorough airing of our constitutional obligations that I have witnessed. In exchanges that can only be publicly accessed and viewed today, members of the House and our colleagues in the Senate engaged in an intelligent, enlightening exchange of ideas about the merits, the dangers, necessities of passing a resolution authorizing American troops to engage in military force overseas. There were strong views on both sides of the aisle, but the views were accompanied by an overriding sense of duty to our country, a belief that Congress would reach a decision based upon the thoughtful and prudent votes of its members, and a reflection of the common interest of all its citizens. As historians look back on the debate over the Persian Gulf War, they can clearly see a vibrant democracy. A democracy that is engaged in robust debate, and a democracy earnestly working together for the best interest of its people. 2 decades later, we stand in a room that's imbued with this history. That debate took place right here. But we avoid the robust debates that preceded us here today. Indeed, the way in which today's measures are being debated shame the dignity, history, and tradition of this body. Today's resolutions about our actions in Libya have been rushed through the House of Representatives. They were written behind closed doors, received neither committee hearings nor committee markups. The 2 resolutions being considered on a single closed rule. following an emergency meeting of the Rules Committee yesterday afternoon. The process by which these measures proceeded through the Rules Committee is indicative of the chaotic and rushed process that we're being asked to vote for here today. Late Tuesday night, 10 o'clock, I believe, we were given two resolutions for an emergency meeting on Wednesday. They were added as emergency items to our afternoon meeting, but when we got to the Rules Committee, they had been pulled from the agenda. It wasn't until 9 p.m. Wednesday that we received the text of H.R. 2278. Yesterday, we were notified that the Rules Committee would meet on this new and unvetted bill along with one of the original two resolutions less than 3 hours before the meeting began. We now stand on the House floor being asked to vote for a closed rule. We will then be asked to consider two resolutions of historic proportions with no ability to shape and adjust the measures to reflect the true will of the House. Mr. Speaker, I really regret the shameful way this important debate has been rushed through Congress, and I apologize to future generations who will look back on the work that we're doing today to try to understand the time. Quite simply, the legislative process matters. Historians, scholars, and yes, future members of Congress will look back at our actions today to see how their forebears shaped the fate of this country. In the case of the resolution of the Persian Gulf, they'll see how our democratic process thrived, whether one agreed with the resolution or did not. Shamefully, in the case of today's resolutions, they will see a dysfunctional democratic process, one that has committed a disservice to the American people, to the dignity of the House of Representatives and the future of the United States, by avoiding a true debate on one of the most important issues of our time. For these very reasons, I urge my colleagues to vote no on today's rule and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlelady from New York reserves. Gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I'm pleased to yield 3 minutes to a gentleman who has great reverence for the United States Constitution, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Paul.
Gentleman is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I rise in support of this rule, although I have a lot of complaints about how we deal with the issue of war. This is a debate that should have gone on 4 months ago before the war was started, and if we'd have done this properly, we wouldn't be bringing this up quickly. No committee work, no discussion, no chance for amendment. But nevertheless, I will support the rule because at least we get a chance to talk a little bit about what's going on in Libya. We have two resolutions that will come up under this rule. The first resolution, generally I understand most individuals aren't too keen on this because it's a literal endorsement. It's a rather explicit endorsement of the war, and I obviously would be opposed to H.J. Res. 68. But my greatest concern is about H.R. 2278. Because the way I read this resolution is that it essentially grants the same authority that we grant in the first one, because we say that, oh no funds can be used, deny the use of funds, but how can you deny the use of appropriated funds when they're using funds that weren't appropriated? It's so redundant. The funds were never appropriated, so yes, it's a good statement. No funds, you don't continue to be illegal is what we're saying. But what I'm concerned about are the exceptions. All the exceptions are for the things that they're doing, you know, like search and rescue, intelligence gathering, renaissance, surveillance, refueling, operations planning, and doing everything except pulling the trigger. So we're legalizing that. I believe that H.R. 2278 is the first time that we in the Congress are making a statement that we are granting authority to the President to pursue this particular war. So I am in strong opposition to that resolution as well, although I understand the other side of the argument because it says denial of funds. But, you know, the resolution actually says that, you know, the main reason, the author of the resolution said, the reason why we have the exception is to protect the integrity of our contract or agreement with NATO. Well, in the resolution said we have to stop the funding because we don't want to support NATO's war. So it's totally inconsistent, makes no sense whatsoever, but it reminds me of the War Powers Resolution. You know, after the Vietnam War, we didn't want to get into that kind of war anymore, so they come along to Congress, and its infinite wisdom is, with great good intentions, designs the War Powers Resolution, which legalized war for 90 days. That's part of the reason why we're here. We're worrying about it 90 days, but here we're going into the 4th month dealing with the War Powers Resolution. There's a simple solution to all of this, and that is obey the Constitution, don't allow our presidents to go to war without a declaration of war, and we wouldn't be facing this problem of this debate that actually gets a little bit silly on restraining the president. Yes, we should. We should exert ourselves. We have the prerogatives. We have the obligations. And we have avoided it. It's time to stand up for the rule of law.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentlelady from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler.
Gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to the Hastings resolution and in support of the Rooney resolution. This morning's paper, New York Times, says that this is a dangerous resolution because it would allow financing only for American surveillance, search and rescue missions, planning and area refueling, and would halt drone strikes and attacks on Libyan air defenses. It would damage the nation's credibility and its leadership of NATO. Mr. Speaker, I think that the nation's credibility, that is to say its promise to go to war if backed by the President, not by Congress, ought to be damaged. We have been sliding for 70 years to a situation where Congress has nothing to do with the decision about whether to go to war or not, and the President is becoming an absolute monarch. In this situation, and we must put a stop to that right now, if we don't want to become an empire instead of a republic. This country was set up to be a republic where the basic questions of war and peace were supposed to be by this Congress. Because of the exigencies of the Cold War, if the bombers are coming over the pole, you don't have time to call Congress. We lost a lot of that power. We ceded it to the President. But in a situation such as Libya, whether the reasons for going there are good or ill, the fact is there was no imminent threat to the United States. The Secretary of Defense said that. There was plenty of time to negotiate with the Arab League, plenty of time to go to the UN. There should have been time to get not consultations with Congress, but an authorization from Congress. In the absence of that authorization, we have to put our foot down now and say no. And if foreign countries learn that they cannot depend on American military intervention unless Congress is aboard for the ride, good. That's a good thing. The power of the presidency, and I'm not talking about this president, as was said by Charles James Fox in 1780, the power of the crown, in this case the power of the president, has increased, is increasing, and ought to be diminished. This country's power to go to war or not must reside here, except in extreme and urgent emergencies. It's time to put our foot down now by passing that resolution. I thank you.
Time has expired. Gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from North Carolina, Ms. Fox.
Gentlelady is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague from Georgia for yielding time. I rise today in support of this rule and of H.R. 2278, a bill to prohibit funds for continued U.S. military involvement in Libya, except for operations involving search and rescue, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, aerial refueling, and operational planning. In 2007, then the junior senator from Illinois, Barack Obama, confidently proclaimed to the Boston Globe this comment, quote, "The President does not have power under the Constitution to unilaterally authorize a military attack in a situation that does not involve stopping an actual or imminent threat to the nation," end quote. However, now that he is not attacking political opponents, that stance has proven inconvenient, prompting one of his many, many flip-flops, such as his vote opposing to raise the debt limit. Regardless of one's position on the constitutional powers of the President as Commander-in-Chief or Congress's authority to declare war, the legislative branch unquestionably yields the power of the purse. This bill represents a proper exercise of that power, pure and simple. The bill does not leave our military personnel in dangerous circumstances without the funds or supplies they need. It does not require precipitous withdrawal, since without a ground presence, there is nowhere from which to withdraw. The bill simply denies U.S. taxpayer funding for what the President calls a kinetic activity, but what the world recognizes as an ongoing bombing campaign in Libya. It is for these reasons and many more that I urge my colleagues to support the rule and to support H.R. 2278. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Gentlelady from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi.
Gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the lady from New York, Mr. Speaker. We are later this morning going to be engaged in one of the most important tasks of Congress, and that is what to do about war. Unfortunately, the administration, and I think they would agree to this, didn't adequately engage Congress in the process running up to the beginning of the Libya conflict, and insufficient during the course of it. We are now in a position where we will be making some decisions today about how we want this nation to proceed, whether we want to proceed with a full-on war, a limited, or a much more limited activity with regard to the support of NATO in the Libya fight. Unfortunately, all of this is now being rushed upon us here in the last day just before the break for the 4th of July. The amount of time to debate this on the floor is far too limited. It would have been our preference on the Democratic side to have a more full discussion along the lines that the gentlelady from New York discussed in her opening comments, a full-on discussion about how we are to proceed. We are basically going to have two options, both of them with inadequate discussion. I guess we're down to that point now where we have no more alternative but to use the 1 hour. So here we are debating this issue at this moment. For me, there's a very important principle that was enunciated by the United Nations, which is the obligation to defend and protect. And that was the basic rationale for this country moving forward with the Libya operation. Yes, the President should have come to us early, should have come to us at the very beginning and allowed Congress to carry out its constitutional obligations, yes or no. But here we are. The obligation or the right or the necessity to defend is very important. That's why we're there. We need to provide the President with the necessary powers to carry out that obligation in a very limited period of time. We'll see that this afternoon or later this morning with the Hastings Amendment. I yield back my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlelady from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Woolsey.
Gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased that the House has the opportunity today to actually have a serious debate on the war with Libya. Like most Americans, I'm disappointed in any argument that says we are not at war. I believe that argument shows contempt for the Constitution and for the executive's co-equal branch of government, the United States Congress. How can this not be war? If another country launched aggressive airstrikes against the United States, you better believe we'd consider it an act of war. Does anyone remember Pearl Harbor? 9/11? We certainly considered those acts of war against our country. To say that our bombing of Libya does not rise to the level of hostilities flies in the face of common sense. Mr. Speaker, our nation can't afford a third war. The ones we're already fighting are bankrupting us morally and fiscally. This Congress must reassert our power of the purse and not fund an unauthorized war. And today we must send a clear message. The American people and this Congress will not support perpetual war.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Speaker, this time I'm pleased to yield 5 minutes to the chairman of the Rules Committee, the gentleman from California, Mr. Dreyer.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes. Without objection.
Speaker, I thank my friend from Lawrenceville for his typical stellar management of this very important rule. But I have to say, Mr. Speaker, that it saddens me greatly that we are here on the House floor dealing with this. We have been in the midst of what has been a celebration. The celebration is described as the Arab Spring. We saw a few months ago a young merchant in a small town in Tunisia very, very distraught over the fact that a government official came and took his scale away from him and took it to the government office, and he went back and asked for it. And when he made that request, he was denied it. And he basically said he'd had enough. And so this young man chose to set himself afire in the middle of the town square in this tiny town in Tunisia. Now, as we all know, that launched what has become known as the Arab Spring. The Economist magazine very appropriately said that one of the great developments that the Arab Spring has wrought is that we have now seen those so-called barbarians in the Arab world, in the Muslim world, move towards self-determination. Many people in the West and in other parts of the world very arrogantly said, there is no way in the world that those people could possibly make great strides towards political pluralism, the development of the rule of law, self-determination. But in fact, we saw, beginning with this one very sad act, people throughout the Arab world, in not only Tunisia, but Egypt, Bahrain, and yes, in Libya, demonstrate their frustration over authoritarian dictatorships that were actually undermining the potential of the people of each of these countries. And so that's why, Mr. Speaker, it saddens me greatly that we are here today doing what it is that we're doing. Why? Because we should be in the midst of a celebration of these very bold and dynamic steps that are being taken throughout the Arab world. And why is it that we're here? We're here because of what has been described by members on both sides of the aisle as, I just heard my friend from New York describe the actions of this presidency as being the act of a monarch. And now, Mr. Speaker, I think it's very important for us to look at recent history. If we go back to the 2006 election, the Republicans lost the majority in large part because of the war in Iraq. Democrats and Republicans alike acknowledge that. There's an important distinction that needs to be made. If one goes back and looks at the action that was taken by President Bush, he chose to come to this Congress. He wanted the support of the American people through their elected representatives and senators to be behind his effort. We all know that he reached out to the United Nations, built a coalition, and there was lots of controversy. There to this day continues to be controversy. But the Congress was involved in that process, as has been the case in many instances in the past. Not every instance, but many instances in the past. We know, as my friend from Grandfather Community, North Carolina, just said, that President Obama, when he was a candidate as a United States Senator, was very critical of President Bush. We know that his campaign for the presidency, in large part, centered around this notion of bringing home the troops, and we had his speech night before last on dealing with Afghanistan, and his notion that we were going to bring these efforts to an end. Now, I would argue, Mr. Speaker, that as we, I said, should be in the midst of celebrating the Arab Spring, we probably would have had, when one thinks about the actions that took place in Libya, we probably would have had, Mr. Speaker, pretty broad support here in the Congress for the action that was taken by the President, if there had been an early authorization of this. Now, it is, as I said, very sad that we are here now because I think Democrats and Republicans alike acknowledge that this has been very, very poorly handled. Now, Mr. Speaker, I don't know if there's any more
happy to
time.
yield 2 additional minutes to the chairman.
The gentleman is recognized for 2 additional minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my friend for yielding. And let me just say that as we look at this, Mr. Speaker, I think that we need to recognize that there are other very troubled spots in the world. We just today have gotten word of thousands of Syrians who are fleeing to Turkey because of the barbaric acts that have taken place there. And so I think that as we look at the great positive steps that have been taken in the Arab world, we need to make sure that the United States Congress and the President of the United States are in this together. There should be consultation and authorization to deal with this. And, Mr. Speaker, I've got to say that as we look at this rule itself, I really am absolutely stunned at the kinds of things that I've heard from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. Now, Mr. Speaker, as my good friend from Rochester, New York, Ms. Slaughter, knows, as we began the debate on this, we've had complete compliance with the 3-day layover requirement. And we have these measures before us. And I would say to my friend from Rochester, Mr. Speaker, there was not a single amendment offered in the Committee on Rules to deal with this. Not a single amendment offered. And, in fact, one of these measures is offered by a Republican, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Rooney. The other is offered by a Democrat, the other gentleman from Florida, Mr. Hastings. And so when I think about 3 o'clock in the morning on June 26th of 2009, we'd begun on June 25th of 2009, we began the debate on this horrible idea of cap and trade. And it was 3 o'clock in the morning that I was sitting upstairs with my Rules Committee colleagues, Mr. Speaker, and dropped in my lap, still hot because it had just come off of the copying machine, was 300 pages of an amendment that we reported out and came, I'm sorry.
For 2 additional minutes.
I thank my friend for yielding. And Mr. Speaker, let me just say, at 3 o'clock in the morning, we were handed this measure. Now, what we have before us has, again, complied with the 3-day layover requirement. Not a single amendment was offered, and there's a proposal offered by a Democrat and a proposal offered by a Republican. And so, Mr. Speaker, I have to say that I believe that this rule is one that does allow for a free-flowing debate. It allows for an opportunity to consider this, and it's not as if we haven't been engaged in this discussion for a long period of time. My friend from Cleveland is here, and he has played a very, very constructive role in leading the charge on this over the past several weeks, as he often does. And I believe that our ability to continue this debate is an important one. But again, Mr. Speaker, let me just conclude by saying it saddens me that at a time when we should be celebrating the fact that there are people in the Arab world who are seeking the opportunity to enjoy the kinds of freedoms that we have here in the United States of America, that the President of the United States has chosen to go it alone without recognizing the very, very important responsibility of the first branch of the United States government. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back his time. The gentlelady from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Kucinich.
This gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
The right to protect civilians has morphed into the so-called right to change a regime and the right to destroy civilians. The situation is positively Orwellian, and it's all going wrong. Even early supporters of the war are changing their minds. I would quote from Al Jazeera just a couple days ago. Italy's foreign minister and the outgoing head of the Arab League have each called for a halt to hostilities in the war-torn North African country. Franco Frattini told members of Parliament on Wednesday that the suspension of military operations in Libya was essential for immediate humanitarian aid, and Emir Moussa, the Arab League chief, called for a political solution to the crisis. Moussa's sentiment was shared by the Italian foreign minister, who called for urgent humanitarian aid to trapped residents in cities like Tripoli and Misurata. He said the people in those areas face a dramatic humanitarian situation, and added that a suspension of hostilities would also avoid consolidating a division of Libya between East and West. He said he hoped the European Council in Brussels on Thursday would highlight an end to the fighting in Libya as a practical solution. The question is, Mr. Speaker, will Congress rush into the breach here while our allies are headed to the exit? H.R. 2278 by Mr. Rooney would immediately prevent the administration from engaging in direct offensive hostilities in Libya, and it ought to be supported. Now, the resolution isn't perfect. It doesn't end the war in its entirety immediately. But it does make clear that the United States will not take over the war as European support continues to diminish. I propose an amendment with Representative Amish of Michigan and 11 others to the Defense Authorization Bill that would eliminate all funds for military operations in Libya. I urge a vote for this bipartisan amendment when we come back after the recess. H.R. 2278 and the Kucinich-Amash amendment are complementary. If we want to end U.S. involvement, we can do it in two steps. First step, vote for H.R. 2278. Second step, vote for Kucinich-Amash when we come back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentlelady from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Gentlelady is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentlelady. I thank the Speaker. I stand here this morning as someone who has opposed the Iraq War and consistently opposed the Afghanistan War under both Republican and Democratic presidents. I think it is important to stop the politics this morning and recognize that mistakes were made by presidents of all political parties. The War Powers resolution that is now being debated as being unconstitutional by my Republican friends has a very strong purpose. It is the purpose of this joint resolution to fulfill the intent of the framers of the Constitution of the United States and ensure that the collective judgment of both the Congress and the President will apply to the introduction of United States armed forces into hostilities or into situations where imminent involvement in hostilities is clearly going to occur. Now we have Republicans suggesting that the War Powers resolution is unconstitutional. What do they want? This is a political game. I voted for Mr. Kucinich's resolution, and the Republicans had the opportunity to also vote for Mr. Kucinich's resolution. This is to embarrass the President. Now, I agree with the underlying sentiment that this was handled badly and that there should have been consultation. Now there is an opportunity for authorization. We need to debate this, not whether it is President Obama, but whether or not there is a collaborative effort between NATO's and the Arab League to address this hostile situation in Libya. And frankly, I don't like the politics of this. The politics says it's okay if it's a Republican president, but not okay if it's Mr. Obama. I am interested in preserving the integrity of this Constitution and have consistently voted that Congress has a right to declare war. But we are now engaged in a consultation process, and I hope members will engage in the debate on the basis of the right decision to make. I am against war. Bring the troops home from Afghanistan. End the war in Iraq. But right now, this should not be Republicans against Democrats on the question of whether or not we are in a collaborative effort with NATO on this issue of Libya. We are attempting to save lives. Take the politics out of it.
Gentlelady's time.
Happy to yield the gentlelady an additional minute.
Gentlelady is recognized for 1 additional minute.
I thank the distinguished gentlelady. I went to the Libyan embassy at the very start of this horrific crisis and stood with the Libyan ambassador that resigned and called for the resignation of General Gaddafi. Today, I continue to call for the cessation of violence and the violence and abuse against the Libyan people. But we have to address this question away from the cloud, as I indicated, of politics. We must adhere to the Constitution, Congress's right to declare war, but I can't understand this now backside debate about the War Powers resolution being constitutional. For some of us, we believe that the contents of it insist that it is. So my point to my colleagues is the Kucinich resolution was on the floor, and every Republican had the opportunity to vote for it. Why we are here again with a resolution that imitates the debate that we had, I believe the underlying principle and premise is to embarrass this administration and President Obama. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume to say
Gentleman's recognized.
I absolutely agree with the gentlelady. This is no place for politics, and that's why, as Mr. Kucinich has led this effort time after time after time, he's had tremendous support from the Republican side of the aisle. This is not about Republicans and Democrats. This is about the Constitution of the United States. This is about the 911,000 people I represent back home. This is about the people's voice being behind the President. As the Chairman of the Rules Committee said, this should not be a time for division. This should be a time for unification. I absolutely agree with my colleagues who are concerned about the debate happening today on June 24th. The time for the debate was March 18th. The time for the debate was before this got started to begin with. But we have been put in this box, Mr. Speaker, and we have a constitutional responsibility to find our way out of it. We have on the floor today, under this rule, two opportunities to make our constituents' voices heard, and I encourage a strong yes vote for this rule so that we can bring those opportunities to the floor. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. The gentlelady from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Lee, who just left the room.
No, just reserve your time.
Let me just reserve my time.
Gentlelady reserves.
I see Mrs. Lee is back. I'm happy to yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Lee.
Gentlelady from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, and Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the ranking member for yielding and for her leadership and for this very important debate. This morning, let me just say, this debate, I believe, should have taken place at least 2 weeks prior to the war in Libya. The War Powers Act specifically forbids armed forces from engaging militarily in foreign lands for more than 60 days without congressional authorization of the use of military force or a declaration of war. And we should really make no mistake about it. We are at war in Libya today. And we've been actively fighting in the Gaddafi regime in Libya since March 19th, which is 97 days ago. No one in this House now would defend the deplorable actions of Colonel Gaddafi and the decades he has spent repressing the Libyan people. But no one should fail to recognize that the actions we have taken in Libya since March 19th amount to a war. Missile strikes, naval attacks, bombing of strategic military targets, all of these actions would be a declaration of war if a foreign country launched such attacks on any country, including our own soil. We have committed $1 billion and thousands of servicemen and women to a new front. And regardless of one's position on our involvement in Libya, one point is crystal clear. This debate should have happened before we launched a war in Libya. Now, on March 30th of this year, I joined with Representatives Woolsey, Honda, and Grijalva and Waters, and we sent a letter to Speaker Boehner urging him to bring forth an authorization of the use of military force in Libya and stressing the need for a robust debate and vote in line with our congressional prerogative and indeed obligation. Unfortunately, may I have another 2 minutes?
I would be pleased to yield another 2 minutes.
The gentlelady is recognized for an additional 2 minutes.
Thank you. Unfortunately, the Speaker did not grant our request, and we find ourselves here today debating this important constitutional issue well over the 90 days after hostilities began. So you'll have to forgive me if I'm somewhat skeptical about the political motives behind the floor actions that are scheduled today, because we really need to recognize, understand that this is serious business and it should not be politicized. This is not about this president or any president. This is not about politics or isolationism. This is about the War Powers Act and the Constitution. It's about standing up for this body and our important role in one of the most solemn and one of the most important decisions that we make as lawmakers, and that's the decision to declare war. Now, unfortunately, this resolution from my colleague, Mr. Rooney, before us today has many exemptions that are very broad and, of course, falls short of ending this war. I have some concerns that I would like to discuss later in terms of some of the limitations and exemptions, in terms of making sure that this does not broaden the war with these exemptions. And I hope that today, though we stand up for our Constitution, we must oppose, I believe, the resolution that gives carte blanche authorization to continue the war in Libya after the fact. And I want to thank, again, our ranking member for allowing for this debate, and the chairman of the Rules Committee, and Mr. Kucinich and Mr. Romer, everyone, for at least encouraging this debate to move forward. I guess we could say today, better late than never, but I certainly wish we had adhered to our constitutional responsibility before the military engagement began.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentlelady from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further requests for time, and I